We're going to continue our study of Aristotle's Nicomachean Ethics, moving into chapter 8 of book 2. In chapter 6, just for a quick review, we discussed a general or universal principle that there are many ways to do bad things for bad actions, because only the medium between two extreme vices may be considered good. And while there are many ways to do bad, there's only one way to do good, and that's to hit the mark of the medium between the two extremes. That was a universal principle Aristotle introduced in chapter 6, and then in chapter 7, Aristotle showed us how we're going to move from that universal principle to the study of specific or particular virtues and vices in our study of ethics. We're going to read in this lesson chapter 8 as we continue to move forward in our study, and I'll read through the chapter and provide some comments any place where I feel the reading may be difficult for students getting started in their studies. So let's read together chapter 8 of book 2 of Aristotle's Nicomachean Ethics. Chapter 8. Since, however, there are three dispositions of the soul, two of vices, of which the one subsists according to excess, the other according to defect. And since virtue is one of these three dispositions of the soul, and is a medium, all these three dispositions are in a certain respect opposed to all. For the extremes are contrary to the middle, and they're contrary to each other. But the middle is contrary to the extremes. For as the equal is, with reference to the less, greater, but with reference to the greater, the equal is less, thus the middle habits exceed with reference to those deficiencies, but are defective with reference to the excesses, both in passions and actions. For the brave, with reference to the timid man, appears to be audacious, but with reference to the audacious man, a brave man seems timid. In a similar manner, the temperate man, with reference to him who is insensate, or does not pursue pleasure in a natural way, but is defective in pleasure, the temperate man appears to be intemperate. But with reference to the intemperate man, who pursues too much pleasure, the temperate man may appear to be insensate and not seek enough. But the liberal man, when contrasted with the illiberal man, appears to be a prodigal. But when he is compared with the prodigal, he appears to be illiberal, to not give enough money. Hence the extremes propel the medium, each to the other. And I should say here that when he says the extremes propel the medium each to the other, he's saying that each of the extremes causes the medium to appear to be not the medium. It causes the medium to appear to be the opposite. Okay, but these are just appearances. These are just relative appearances. Okay? Hence the extremes propel the medium each to the other, and the timid calls indeed the brave man audacious, but the audacious man calls him timid, calls the brave man timid. And analogously in the other extremes, in the same way with the other extremes. These, however, being thus opposed to each other, there is a greater contrariety in the extremes to each other than to the medium. For these are more remote from each other than from the medium. And just as the great is more remote from the small, and the small is more remote from the great, than both of them are from the equal. Farther still, in some extremes, there appears to be a certain similitude to the medium, as in audacity to fortitude, and in prodigality to liberality. In other words, the extremes in some way are similar to the medium, in that they contain some certain quality or characteristic that's true of the medium. But in the extremes, there is the greatest dissimilitude to each other. Things, however, which are very distant from each other are defined to be contraries, so that those things which are more distant are more contrary to each other. But to the medium, in some things indeed the deficiency is more opposed, and in others the excess. So, in other words, in some virtues and vices, there are two opposing or two contrary vices, and then there's the medium, which is the virtue. But in some of these considerations, one of the extremes is worse than the other. Okay? One of the extremes is worse than the other. So the two extremes, the two opposite vices, both of them may be considered bad actions, but often one of them is worse than the other. Okay? One of them is worse than the other. And we'll hear people say things like, I would rather err on the side of mercy. And what they're saying is, if I'm going to commit a bad action, I would rather if my bad action was on the side of too much mercy rather than too much strictness. I would rather err on the side of mercy, or I would rather err on the side of caution. Rather than be too audacious and bring harm or danger upon others, I would rather err on the side of timidity and be careful. So we hear people say things like that, which reveals to us that even though there are contrary vices, both of which are considered to be bad, and the medium only to be considered good, often one of those extremes is better than the other. Okay? That's what Aristotle is referring to here. In some extremes, there appears to be a certain similitude to the medium, as in audacity to fortitude, and in prodigality to liberality. But in the extremes, there is the greatest dissimilitude to each other. Things, however, which are very distant from each other are defined to be contraries, so that those things which are more distant are more contrary to each other. But to the medium, in some things, the deficiency is more opposed, and in others the excess. Thus, to fortitude, audacity, which is an excess, is not opposed as much, but timidity, which is a defect. So with respect to fortitude, even though fortitude is a medium between timidity and audacity, audacity is less opposed to fortitude than timidity. Right? I hope you understand that concept. And to temperance, the want or lack of sensibility, which is an indigence, is not opposed but intemperance, which is an excess. So with regard to temperance, it would be better to be insensate than to be intemperate. Intemperance is more contrary to the medium, which is temperance. This, however, happens from two causes. So why is this? Aristotle says that there are two reasons for this. One, from the thing itself. For one of the extremes being nearer to and more similar to the medium than the other. Hence not this, but the contrary is more opposed to the medium. Thus, for instance, since audacity appears to be more similar and nearer to fortitude, but timidity appears to be more dissimilar to fortitude. And on this account, we oppose the latter, that is, timidity. We oppose the latter to fortitude rather than the former, audacity. For things which are more distant from the medium appear to be more contrary. This, therefore, is one cause from the thing itself. That's the first cause. Another cause is from ourselves. For those vices to which we are naturally more adapted, those vices to which we are naturally more adapted or more inclined, appear to be more contrary to the medium. Thus, because we are naturally more adapted or inclined to seek pleasures, we are more easily impelled to intemperance than to moderation in the pursuit of pleasure. Those things, therefore, are said to be in a greater degree contraries, to which a greater accession is made. And on this account, intemperance, which is an excess, is more contrary to temperance than the other extreme, which would be insensibility. And that's the end of chapter 8. So Aristotle continues to go into greater detail in this study and introduce us little by little, as a good teacher, to the complexities of the study. So we talked about in chapter 6 and 7 that the virtue is a medium between two opposing vices, two extremes, one being deficient, the other being excessive in a certain kind of action. The only thing that can be good is the medium between the two, and that may lead to an oversimplification. We may think, well, there are just like these two opposite extremes, and then the middle, if we divide them by 2, we have the middle, and that's virtue. But Aristotle is saying, no, it's not that simple. It's not that simple, because there are other factors. Different virtues and vices, the very nature of them, causes the medium to be in a way closer to one extreme than the other. So we're not talking about an exact middle between, we're not talking about a mathematical middle between the two. Divide the difference by 2 and that's the medium. It's not that simple. Sometimes the nature of the action makes one of the extremes closer to the right action than the other. And so that's one reason why the medium is not necessarily simple. The other reason is that we, as human beings, are inclined more to one extreme than the other. And so that leads to a couple of different conclusions. First of all, let's say if we're talking about fear, so the one extreme is timidity, the other extreme is audacity. To which one do we naturally incline? We naturally incline towards timidity. We tend to be afraid of things that we shouldn't be afraid of. Okay? So that would make bravery appear to us to be closer to audacity than to timidity. It's actually difficult for us to reach the middle because we're inclined to the defect, which is timidity. The same thing is true with pleasure. We all tend to intemperance. We all tend to excessive desire for pleasure. And therefore, temperance appears to us to be closer to insensibility than to intemperance, because intemperance for us is natural. Insensibility for us is almost unimaginable. And temperance often feels like we need to live without sensibility in order to be temperate, but that's not true. We're simply more inclined to intemperance or excessive pleasure. So Aristotle continues to introduce us to some of the complexities or subtleties of the study, and these are the things that separate a wise man from a pretender or a beginner in philosophy. The wise man doesn't oversimplify the studies, The wise man understands those factors that cause the subjects to be complex and that require greater subtlety and carefulness. Aristotle's introducing us to these subtleties in a masterful way that's very helpful for us. And so we see that as we go into this study, we have to guard against oversimplification, which is not wisdom. We have to recognize that there are some factors that cause things to be more complex than they might appear. But fortunately, Aristotle is teaching us the causes of these complicating factors so that we can understand why we need to be subtle and careful in these reasonings. So I hope that's a helpful introduction to Chapter 8 of Book 2 in Aristotle's Nicomachean Ethics. In the next video, we'll study Chapter 9 and finish up Book 2. God bless your studies.